To begin, I want to ask you a question. You know what you say to someone, but do you always know if that person understands what you mean for them to understand? It's all in communication, isn't it? And that, I think, is particularly important in a couple of areas that we will touch on with a man who is, in fact, a great communicator and knows all about the power of communication, and that is Fred Garcia. Good morning, Fred.
Good morning, Jane.
I'm so glad that you're joining me because I see so much and so often a complete misunderstanding of what is said, which means to me that people really don't always know how to communicate.
Yeah, there's a huge difference between sending a message and having that message be received and processed and understood, whether it's in an interpersonal interaction with a friend or a family member, or in the workplace with a boss, but we're seeing a lot of it in particular playing out in public on our televisions and on the internet. And hopefully we can take what we see, up on the big screen and begin to harvest lessons that can help us interpersonally be better at making ourselves understood.
And I think in the horrible tragedy in Aurora, Colorado recently, that there was something that came out of that, stemming from that, which was a very, very bad example of miscommunication.
It was an example of a phenomenon where the meaning of the words you use is often determined by the context in which the hearer is currently in. So something that works, that makes sense, that is completely benign on one day, on another day, in another context, may be horribly offensive or insulting or even inaccurate. So what happened in the aftermath of the Aurora shooting, if you recall, the shooting happened at about 2:30 in the morning East Coast time. And as people on the East Coast began to wake up, their email alerts were filled with news accounts of what had happened. If you turn on the morning shows, all the morning shows were about the shooting in Aurora. There were police coming on to talk about the fear of copycats. There were law enforcement people saying we're going to start putting uniformed officers in movie theaters. Anywhere you went on the news and anywhere you went on the internet, it was all about the shooting. But then at 9:30 in the morning, there was a tweet that appeared, and it went viral very quickly. And that was a tweet by the American Rifleman account of the National Rifle Association. And at 9:30 in the morning, or 9:20 in the morning, they put out a tweet that said, good morning, shooters. Happy Friday. Weekend plans, ? And it obviously was intended to be a greeting to people who are sports shooters. But in the immediate aftermath of the Aurora, Colorado mass murder by firearm, the people watching the internet, seeing that, were horrified, and initially they thought it was a hoax. They thought it was a really bad taste practical joke. So news reporters started poking around and saying, is this legitimate? Is this for real? And then they discovered, yes, it is. It was an actual account of an actual National Rifle Association publication, and it seemed to be legitimate. And for 3 hours, there were people tweeting, expressing their outrage or something. Now, to be clear, that greeting on Thursday would have been perfectly fine, but on Friday it was seen to be in horrible taste. Finally, I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say that's a prime example of something being taken completely out of context. In this case, I think more of a day or a date time of context. There are all kinds of contexts, I suppose.
There are all kinds of contexts, and one of the challenges for communicators is to understand the context into which they're communicating. And whether it's in this instance or in the political campaign or even, when you go to somebody's house, you don't criticize their decor or their food. There's an expectation of politeness. And you can talk to your friends about, the furniture was a little shabby and the food wasn't very good and the hostess wasn't very nice another time. You don't do it in the house.
Not if you expect to be invited back, that's for sure.
That's right. But we actually saw something just like that over the past week in the political campaign. and that is what happened in London in the day before the opening ceremony of the Olympics. And as you recall, Governor Romney went on his first foreign trip as a presidential candidate, and his campaign said it was essentially a charm offensive, a goodwill tour to introduce a potential next president to the world community. And it was going to start in London, and then it was going to go on to Israel and then go on to Poland. And the opening ceremonies were Friday, but on Thursday, in an interview with Brian Williams that was seen all over London, all over Britain, Governor Romney, who is a former chair of the Salt Lake City Olympics Committee, said two things. They got the Britons into a bit of a lather, and that is he said that he wasn't certain that the British people would turn out to support the Olympic Games that began next day in London. And he said that he was a little concerned that some of the preparations, especially around security, were not sufficient. And that provoked huge outrage in Britain. It provoked the Prime Minister to actually say at a press conference, it isn't easy to stage a successful Olympic Games in one of the busiest cities in the world. Said it's a lot easier to do that in the middle of nowhere.
Yes, in essence, he almost fell into the same trap that Romney fell into.
Exactly. Of course, that provoked a huge dust-up in Salt Lake City, and the mayor invited the Prime Minister out to Salt Lake City to see that, in fact, it's a very nice city. But it also provoked the mayor of London, Boris Johnson, who was at the torch relay ending point rally with 60,000 people, to personally denounce Mitt Romney and to get the 60,000 people cheering as he said bad things about Mitt Romney. So here in what was supposed to be a charm offensive, it ended up being just the opposite, and the British press had a field day. They said some pretty nasty things, as the British presses want to do, about Governor Romney. He then left London after the opening ceremonies and went to Israel, and in Israel said something, again, off the cuff, that in the process offended the Palestinians and also offended some of the Israelis. And that was a statement that said, if you look at the difference in income per capita between people in the Palestinian territories and people in Israel, you see that the Israelis are far more affluent. He said that's the result of many things, including the history of the Jewish people and also the culture. And, of course, that provoked the Palestinians to immediately denounce Mitt Romney. But it also caused some people in the Jewish community to say, was he really saying that we're better with money? That's not a particularly polite thing to say. So what we're seeing now all over the internet, and of course President Obama's campaign is taking advantage of it, but the news media didn't need a lot of prompting to do it, is the statements intended to be essentially polite statements seem not to be working in Israel, and the statements about the Olympics were just poorly thought through, and he didn't understand that he was speaking in a very proud nation about a source of real pride, and he was essentially saying, your baby is ugly, which is not something you say to a host or hostess when you're at their house.
Well, that's exactly true, and I don't think that if Mr. Romney wants to pursue a successful campaign, that he should make any more foreign trips, because he just doesn't seem to have what it takes to say the right thing at the wrong time. Exactly the opposite. He says the wrong thing at the wrong time, and I'd like to get into a little bit more of this with you, Fred, because sometimes I think maybe we hear what we want to hear rather than what's actually being said, which of course is all about the power of communication. So if you can stay with me while I take just a couple of minutes here for a commercial break, let's get into that. My guest is Fred Garcia, the author of The Power of Communication, and you're listening to him on Viewpoint with Gene Dean on Super Talk, 94.1 FM and AM 930. Give me a couple of minutes and then we'll continue our conversation.
Now back to Viewpoint with Gene Dean on Super Talk 94.1 FM and AM 930.
And my guest is Fred Garcia, author of The Power of Communication. You can check this out on his website, thepowerofcommunication.net. And we're talking about some horrible glitches that have occurred in well-known people or organizations actually not necessarily communicating well. And I am wondering, Fred, do we sometimes hear what we want to hear, what we expect to hear, rather than what is actually being said? Is it not only the fault of the one speaking, but the fault of the one listening?
It is absolutely the case that we often hear what we hope to hear or think we hear or expect to hear, and miscommunication is one of the biggest challenges in a relationship and one of the biggest challenges in the workplace. One of the problems, of course, is that very often words have multiple meanings, and the tone of the words is a critically important factor, and very often the speaker doesn't appreciate the tone that is being used. So, for example, the word fine. The word fine could mean everything is okay, but when spoken fine, it means something else. So, how are you? Fine. The listener may take that to mean one thing, the speaker may take that to mean something else, and there's a perception that something hasn't worked. So it could be that somebody said fine simply because they're busy and trying to get to the telephone to answer the phone, or it could be that they're really upset at the person who asked the question, and we really don't know. As a general principle, I tend to counsel that the burden is on the speaker to make meaning clear, and the speaker has to worry not only about the content of what is spoken, but the tone of what is spoken, and also the attributes of the audience. Is the audience member upset, scared, busy, in the middle of something else? And one of the things I talk about in the book is very often we try to communicate to people when they're really busy, and then we wonder why they didn't even listen or didn't hear what we thought we had said. So part of that miscommunication is essentially trying to get people to listen to you when they're not able to listen, when, for example, they're in the middle of a task. And one of the things we know is that people who are multitasking aren't really multitasking simultaneously. They're serially tasking a little bit in one thing, and then they drop it, and then they pay attention for a little while, and they go back to the other thing. So
how do we correct ourselves on this? I mean, it's not possible, at least I don't think it's possible to, before you say anything to anyone, to mentally think, what are they going to hear that I'm saying? What do I mean to say? Obviously, that's not going to work in conversation, but how can we prepare ourselves to really communicate well?
Well, the first is simply to invite people to pay attention when you're going to ask them a question or tell them something. So something as simple as, "Hey, can I get you to look at me for a moment?" Or what I say in meetings, "Could I ask everyone to please put your iPhones and BlackBerries down for a moment?"
Do you really, Fred? Do you really like it when somebody says "hey" to you? I hate it when somebody says to me, "Hey."
When I'm talking to my teenage daughter, I say, "Hey, listen up. What would you like for dinner?" As opposed to, "What would you like for dinner?" If I say, "Hey, listen up," my teenager will look up at least for a moment from her BlackBerry or from her iPhone and say, "Yeah, Dad." I said, "What would you like for dinner?" But if I didn't say, "What would you like for dinner?" She goes, "Huh? Whatever."
You could use her name. Why not use her name? Everybody has a name.
I say, "Hey, Juliana."
Oh, okay.
But one of the things I find is when people are in the middle of something, some folks consider it impolite to ask for their attention, so they simply speak over whatever the person is doing, and then they don't appreciate that they weren't heard. So the very first opportunity is to get people to pay attention. You may recall from old movies and army bases where the loudspeaker will say, "Now hear this."
Oh,
now
yes.
Hear this. Well, now hear this is essentially, "Hey, stop whatever you're doing and pay attention just for a moment." And we need some equivalent of the "now hear this." "Can I have your attention, please?" is what you typically hear over a PA system in the workplace or at an airport or what have you when they're paging somebody. So the first challenge is, before one speaks, to just make sure that you have the attention of the people you're talking to. If we simply found a way to do that, we would avoid a lot of the miscommunication.
I find that "excuse me" is a very good way to get people's attention. Excuse me? I learned that from a family member.
Excuse me with the right tone can be done very well. Excuse me with a different tone, it gets back to that tone. Excuse me could also convey a tone of insult or offense, or did I really hear what I just heard you say?
Language is fascinating.
It is indeed, and in the English language in particular, words have so many subtle meanings, and we need to be careful, especially with words that stand in for other words. So pronouns are one of the biggest invitations to misunderstanding. Should we do that? Or what do you think of them doing that? And I've been in workplaces where we come out of a meeting and I'll ask 3 different people, what was the decision that was made in the meeting? And I'll have here 3 completely different things. And that's because the person running the meeting used pronouns and invited each person in the meeting to come up with the underlying noun for what the pronoun stood for. And the other thing I do with clients a lot is to urge them to stop using pronouns and to start using proper names and nouns, just as a way to avoid misunderstanding.
Okay, that's a good rule to follow, that's for sure. And while we're talking about communication, of course, it's not just vocal communication, but there's the communication of reading. What you read, I find that quite frequently I read something and then I think, well, that can't possibly be right, so I go back and reread it and find that I have misunderstood. Can you use this power of communication when you are writing as well as speaking?
The written word is processed by one part of the brain. Visual imagery, like what we see on television or when a person is in front of us, is processed by a different part of the brain. One of the things about the written word is you usually can go back and reread, as you just said. So I'm not certain I followed that, or could that really mean what I thought it did? You go back and you can listen again. The challenge, and you can read again. The challenge is when you don't have the opportunity to go back. So here's one of the things we find. Anytime there's a misalignment between the visual and the verbal, it causes problems. I had a client who spoke to an audience once, and he was a business client, and he said, the quality of our products continues to improve. But as he said it, he moved his hand down in a diagonal movement. So he said the quality of our product continues to improve as his hand went down in a diagonal movement. And then he was horrified the next day when the stock market started reacting, and when his people called the investors and said, "Why are you selling our stock?" Said, "Because your quality problems are hurting your sales." He said, "No, that's not what our guy said." He said, "Yes, it is." And what I discovered is the guy who spoke was an engineer, and for him, quality was eliminating defects and eliminating returns under warranty. So when he talks quality is improving, he moves his hand down, and he thinks he's communicating, because for him, quality is the elimination of things that go wrong. But the audience thought of quality as something positive. When they heard the word quality and saw the hand going down, they assumed that quality was deteriorating.
It was really like a thumbs down, wasn't it?
It was like a thumbs down.
Mm-hmm.
And I have students, for example, who when I tell that story, will tell me they were raised in India and now they work in the United States. And in their particular part of India, if they want to agree with someone, they shake their head back and forth. So they've been in meetings where the boss would say, "So you're going to do this, right?" And they would shake their heads back and forth. And they thought they were saying, "Yes, I will do that." But the boss understood that to mean something else.
You know, just this morning before I came on the air, Fred, one of our people on another station here had been talking to a man from Britain, and this gentleman said that he was going on holiday and that he wouldn't be back for a month. And my friend thought, well, that's an awful long holiday. And so he said to me, "Do you use that term?" I said, "Not now. I use the term vacation." So there are so many different meanings to different words. It's a wonder we don't all trip over our tongues every day.
It is a persistent challenge, and holiday in Britain is their word for vacation.
That's right.
Holiday here is a single day, usually a Monday, because the actual holiday falls on a Saturday or Sunday.
That's
right. But when they say we're going on holiday, they think they're communicating, but if it's an American audience, they are actually miscommunicating.
And if you're a Brit like I am and you come and live in this country, you learn the difference between a lot of words, believe me.
Very, very nice. Very, very nice.
Fred, it's very good to talk with you this morning. And as I mentioned earlier, you do have a website for The Power of Communication, thepowerofcommunication.net. And I'm sure we'll all benefit from looking at that. And I thank you so much for joining me this morning.
Thank you, Gene.
Thank you. Bye-bye.